I start each of my novels with an invocation, not a prologue or a beginning. I feel it's important that you have a chapter up front that sets the tone of the book, not necessarily advances the plot, or even worse, that 90s trope of introducing a character having killed by the big bad in that prologue, just to show how powerful and what the protagonist will ultimately be up against. I think that's really lazy, and I never want to do that. I never want to be accused of doing that. So I start with an invocation, and the idea is it is germane to the story that follows, but really is telling the reader how they should read the story from that point onward. I think it's a better way of preparing the reader to read a longer piece of fiction. And I don't mind that as part of my branding too. Invocation feels like a horror prologue, doesn't it? But this is my invocation. This is how I got here. The release of Divide by Zero has been nothing short of amazing experience for me. This book is a long time coming, and it's sort of the coming out book in a way, in that it really is the one that kind of pulls back the covers and reveals that the last two books, Blue Eel and Bleak December, are not just interrelated on surface levels, which you could see if you read closely, but that they're leading to something. But I want to take you back to the very beginning, because that's really where all this begins. I had wanted to be a writer from the age 13. I've told a story in the past about my sister and I, when I was much younger than that, even writing just for fun one day. And that got the idea in my head. But when I hit about 13, I really wanted to do it because I had started to read seriously. And the Shadows anthologies from Charles L. Grant, Stephen King's Night Shift. And I really wanted to see if I could do what these writers that I so admired did. So I wrote, and the first thing I wrote was a really lame little, it's a werewolf story, kind of. There's not much to it. It was very short. I think I had grand expectations of what I was able to accomplish, and it didn't pull off any of those things. But as a kid, to complete a story and that be a story that hadn't existed before I did it, but now it did exist in the world, maybe to only ever be read by myself and my mother, that was an amazing thing to me. And it opened my eyes up to what creation, really what art is all about. I always say that what art is when you have an idea in your head, transmitting that idea into another person's head is what art is. And there, you could do that with language, which is kind of what writing does, though I would argue that it's a lot more involved than that. You can do it with painting and you can do it with film, but ultimately there's still a separation between your thoughts and mine. The same way people come away from a movie with very different interpretations or very different experiences. A novel lets you get into characters' heads at a much deeper level than any other art form. And done right, I think a great piece of fiction can truly be the most rewarding artistic experience for the person on the other side of the page. I write the words, they read the words. And I think when it works, when you're in sync, you're leaving a big part of yourself in the reader. And I'd experienced that in a small way with that very first story, and I started to really understand that this wasn't just something I wanted to do, it was something I was going to force myself to do. It was something I was going to force to be a part of my life. And certainly life throws curveballs at you, and you don't always pursue what you desperately want to pursue. Also, it's very hard work. And I didn't have the discipline at that age, nor really the attention span to write anything serious. And unfortunately, that story continues through my 20s. In my 30s, I discovered myself out of a job for the first time in really my adult life. And it was a really trying period for me. There was also other things going on psychologically with me. And I remember the day I thought, am I serious about this? Because I either need to make a resolution today to be a writer, and that means actually writing, or I need to give it up. And I need to just realize that I'm a retailer by both occupation and in my heart, and that's what I'm going to do. And the idea that I could be both never really occurred to me at that time. or that I'd have to be both, because of course there's no health care or 401k matches in book sales. But I sat down that day and I said, I'm going to write. And I wrote. And it was a miserable, horrible experience. It wasn't very good. The work was miserable. So I went back the next day and did it again. And it was no better. But I kept doing it. And within a month, I was finally kind of understanding what writing was about, what fiction was about. And I started spending more time exploring online really what this art was about, what had already been discovered and what was still uncharted territory in this world of building fiction. A lot of theories about how to properly do this. And I practiced a lot. I wrote every day. I deleted most of what I wrote. I kept some, completed some stories, and then about a year after I made that proclamation, a thing happened. A story I had submitted sold to a substantial market. And then they all started selling to substantial markets. And the short stories were moving, and they were appearing. And my name was being in these table of contents alongside some of my big heroes, and that's a moment when you realize that your work's considered worthy of some of the people whose, word on the page was what made you want to do this to begin with. Just huge moments. But the money you make from a short story is at best pennies on the word, which sounds great until you realize that like the upside is maybe making $250 to $500 for a short story for most markets. I mean, there's markets that pay better than that, and I've been paid better than that. But in general, that's what you're looking at, and the time it takes, you might as well flip burgers. But the potential of novels to sell and make more money is a lot greater. So I'd made the determination that that's what I had to figure out. And that required me to do a lot more research because, believe me, there's a huge gap between writing a short story and writing a novel. It's almost a completely different art form. So I set out to learn that. And I wrote something that is novel length and finished, and it's never going to see the light of day because it's not good. But I learned. It was the manuscript that really taught me what I was doing. Side note, this is one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of self-publishing original work. I think keeping things in print that have been traditionally published as self-published at that point makes a lot of sense. And in fact, probably is what writers definitely should do. But you need to go through the editorial process, and you need to get your ass rejected a bunch of times to learn that you have to have the discipline. That first manuscript had a small press publisher picked it up, would have tanked my career. No question about it. Because people would never have picked up a second book by me. And reputations do grow in this business of who's worth reading and who's not worth reading. So I wanted to write that next book, and I had some ideas. And those ideas, if you were a reader many years later, you'd recognize as the genesis of Blue Eel. It wasn't all there. But after a few false starts, I realized that I was not ready to do something as complex as Blue Eel at that point. But there was a publisher named Coscom Entertainment who were looking for original traditional monster novellas and novels. And I didn't write that stuff. I don't write that stuff, really. But there was this opportunity, and they seemed genuine. They were starting a horror line. They were giving chances to people who didn't have a track record, really, and maybe didn't have any right to be out there submitting. So it was very seductive. But I looked at that listing on Raylan.com a million times, and I didn't push the trigger. I didn't decide to write something for it, because I don't write werewolves or vampires or witches or mummies, right? That's not who I am, really. I love the classic monsters if you're talking Universal on film, but for me to write that stuff, do I have anything to say? I think the answer is probably absolutely not. At least that's what I thought at the time. But then on the very last day that they were taking queries, because that's what they do, they take queries, and then if they like the pitch, they ask you for a sample, usually 3 chapters and a synopsis. So me being me, I just very late one night, tired, maybe a little depressed, I wrote a synopsis for a book that didn't exist, and I just sent it out as a query to that publisher, to Coscom. And I figured worst case scenario, I can bash out 3 chapters and submit that if they want to consider the work, right? It was more of an experiment to see how it all worked, right? To see what's out there. To my surprise, I was told, send this whole manuscript. We love what we're hearing. So I basically just told everyone in my life they needed to take a back seat for a week, and I was going to do nothing but write this novella. And I did. And I sent it off and got a response back fairly quickly saying, hey, we really dig this, but it doesn't have a real ending, and we want you to write an ending for this. And I was kind of taken aback, you kind of headstrong, and you're kind of proud of what you did, and so I read the entire manuscript, and I realized that they were absolutely right. There wasn't a proper ending. There was a conclusion, but it didn't really. All the dovetailing that should happen at the end of a book didn't happen. That's what was missing. There was a lot of elements that should have led to an ending that got abandoned along the way. So what I did is I crafted an ending, and I retooled sections of the book too, so that it was kind of seamless, and a new ending appeared. And I wrote it, and I submitted it, and that book became Snarl, which was published in 2009, and it did pretty well for a small press book. But this wasn't what I set out to do. I wanted to write news stories that were unlike anything anyone had read before. I didn't want to really write a werewolf novel. But it did pretty well, and the publisher said to me, hey, something zombie would be huge from you right now, because Brian Keene's The Rising is selling so many copies and has really gotten small press titles into a new level of sales. This one book had done that. So, drunk perhaps off the idea of selling a second book in the same calendar year, I agreed. I said, I will write a zombie novel. And I remember when I was asked for the pitch, a television was on in the same room, and the television was set to cycle through the channels, and you could stop it when it found something you liked. You didn't have to keep pushing the button. And on one channel there was The Breakfast Club, and on another there was Dawn of the Dead. So I just pitched, it's Breakfast Club meets Dawn of the Dead. And it was a silly concept as far as I was concerned, but when I sat down to write it, I had fun with it. The Lifeless is probably my least favorite of my work. That's not to slag it. I think it's a lot of fun. I think if you like that type of fiction, I think it's really worthy. But I think I had less to say about the zombie thing than I did about anything else in my writing. So it's ultimately my least favorite of my books. But it did really well. So it put me in a position of, the publisher wanted a third book. And that was kind of a little bit, because I'd earned some money, for the publisher, I had a little bit more leeway to say, well, what do I want to do here? And what I wanted to do was a mummy novel. Because if I had to do a traditional monster, I wanted to do something that really hadn't been done a whole lot. And I'd have all the creative freedom in the world to take it wherever I wanted it. So a mummy novel set in World War II seemed like a dream to write, right? Because it's pulpy as hell, but it's fun and it's globetrotting. So I came up with this concept that the British Museum was trying to safeguard their precious artifacts by sending them to the Smithsonian in America across the ocean. But halfway across the Atlantic, a couple of the exhibits come back to life. Bam, right? So that's a great pitch, I think. And I think it's a fun book. It's a lot more substantial. But what I didn't realize is the publisher was not really interested in continuing the line. So the book didn't receive much in the way of advertising or even publicity. and it kind of fell off. It remains my least popular work as far as sales. That said, I think there's a lot there, and if you're going to read one of my monster novels, read Eternal Unrest, because I think it's the best of the three. But Coscom was out of the game at that point. For a while, the publisher was still using it as a vehicle for some of his own work, but they really weren't publishing other people's writing, and all the catalog titles went out of print, which released them all back to me. But it was a while there where it's like I didn't have anything for print, and you have to go through that crisis of faith of, can I rebuild this, and can I actually do what kind of I set out to do this time? Didn't have any answers, but I decided that I just was going to roll the die, and I was going to write what I wanted to write. And I went back to that idea I'd had so long ago, it felt like, and I wrote Blue Eel. And Blue Eel was always going to be a challenging book to sell, I felt, because it is so different from not just everything that I'd written, but it was different from what was on the market. So there really, I felt, wasn't going to be an easy sell here. Who was going to publish this thing? It's about, these cryptid eels that are probably extraterrestrial, whose blood and secretions cause hallucinations that might be seeing into the future. And there's a cult, and there's this mystery about a daughter that went missing from a bedroom in the middle of the night. There's a lot going on in this book. It's not something you can give an easy elevator pitch to. Blue Eel surprised me, because the very first place I submitted it was a publisher called Dark Continents, and they accepted the book. And then Dark Continents went out of business about 6 months later before they ever edited or produced the book. So that was a thing. But the other thing that happened in the meantime is I kept looking at the book and all these elements I'd put together, and I just kept kind of daydreaming on it. And I realized there was a lot more I wanted to do with the world that was being built there. Ultimately, Cutting Block Books, which was the legacy of Cutting Block Press, it had changed hands. A new owner had taken it over, bought the book after getting kind of it shuffled to them by one of their former editors. And they felt like home, because they had published 5 of my short stories in their horror library series. And the Blue Eel came to them at exactly the right time. They were starting a horror line. It was going to launch the horror line of novels, because they'd done only anthologies before that. The editing of that book was a very painful experience. I butted heads a decent amount with the editor. Part of my concept for that book was that I didn't want to lead the reader around on a leash. I wanted them to be able to make their own decisions about the story being told. And the editor pushed back on that a lot. I just think he didn't understand why it was important to me that it be a open perspective novel, whereas you could read it from your vantage point and get one experience, and someone else would get a vastly different experience. And that was by design, not just because of the limitations of the human experience and how we absorb knowledge. So there was a lot there, and sections of that book changed massively. People ask me if we'll ever see a preferred version of that novel, if I'd ever go back to it and restore it to its original form. The answer is no, because there's elements of that book that ended up being recycled and reused. The stuff that got cut ultimately ended up having a new life in either Bleak December or Divide by Zero, in a very organic way, because it's all the same universe. So it was very easy to repurpose it in the right way. So to put that stuff back in Blue Eel would make it redundant in the book series. So that'll never happen. And while there's certainly things I wish were still in Blue Eel, because I think the experience changed from my original vision, the book is its own thing, and it succeeds on its own level. Rue Morgue magazine gave me a great, review of the book, and there's a pull quote on that that's used on the Amazon page. I have nothing but the greatest admiration for what the book is, thanks to the team over at Cutting Block. But I also will always kind of look back wistfully because it was a painful birth. There was a lot of changes, and it wasn't exactly my original idea. And that made it that I kind of, if you know my personality at all at this point, you know that rather than become like easier to work with when I've been through a situation or a circumstance that is challenging, I probably double down on what I want, and I get unmovable on things. So when I wrote Bleak December, the second book, because it was a 3-book deal with Cutting Block, Bleak December is pretty pure. It's hard stuff. It opens with a setting that is kind of taboo, that you're not supposed to set fiction inside unless it's kind of like this very literary, very highbrow art, and that's not really what I do. I think I do great exploitation literature. I think that's what I strive to do anyway. I shouldn't say I do it. That's up for you to decide whether it's great. But that's my aim, is kind of elevated exploitation. That's kind of my thing. And so I wrote kind of this pure book that gets violent and it gets challenging and it questions the nature of character tropes, really. What is a hero? What is a villain? What is the right thing to do in a situation? When does good actions make things worse? And it was all wrapped up in a concept that was very close to my heart, which was that what if the big bad of a horror novel was the embodiment of Alzheimer's or dementia? What if the story is told from the point of view of a character going through Alzheimer's or dementia? It makes him an unreliable narrator, yes, but it's a pure experience, right? It's the most horrifying experience. So I researched the diseases and I kind of cobbled together like a natural progression of that disease that could be used to focus the story. And the big bad is a character named Clume, who is a godlike figure that can control memory. And there's kind of a underlying question of what reality could even be if you can't trust your memory. Also the notion that everything is a memory, because there's a fraction of a microsecond between something happening and us observing it. So everything is not happening in real time to us all the time, even though it feels like it is, even though we assume it is. And I felt that this was really prime material for a horror novel. And it definitely has elements and references into it that make it very clear that it's the same world as Blue Eel, but it is a completely separate story. Ultimately, Cutting Block decided not to publish the book because of some of its harder-edged elements. And that was not a big surprise. I'd heard some rumors that some changes were definitely happening at Cutting Block. And sure enough, after they passed on the novel and it got picked up by a micro press who ultimately put it out, and the book actually sold better than Blue Eel did. But Cutting Block actually went out of business in the meantime, and that released Blue Eel to me. If you haven't guessed by now in this story, the small press is a really dynamic place, and you better not get attached to any one publisher for long, because they may not be around for as long as you need them to be. And that brings me to Divide by Zero, a book I'd pitched to the owner of Cutting Block when he signed me to the 3-book deal. And at that point, I didn't have a title on it. It was just the cosmic horror / heist novel. And it was not the one that had it had the least work done on it mentally, I'd say. But I really needed to do something different than Bleak December, because Bleak December is what its title implies it is. It's an incredibly dark work. It's a nihilist work. It will break you probably because it has some of the just rending subject matters, right? And I wanted to do something that was a little bit more fun, a little more adventurous. Still dark because that's my thing, but I wanted to do something that would make sense for my readers who have been following me up to this point. And I think crime made sense. And to do kind of like a 70s heist movie meets kind of Lovecraftian horror type thing. But I didn't want to do tentacled monsters. God damn it, we have too many of those. With all apologies to H.P. Lovecraft, I mean, we don't need any more monsters whose names all look like they're from some weird combination of Slavic and Icelandic languages, right? We don't need that anymore. We have it. He did it well. Leave it alone. But I also went and I realized that there was a lot of cosmic horror that had not been really touched on. The idea of cosmic horror is, of course, that it's a world beyond what we can comprehend. So all the assumptions about our world could all be wrong. That's ultimately what I consider cosmic horror to be fundamentally. It's a challenge of the existing orthodox. Fundamental orthodox, right? So like our very beliefs about existence. And I wanted to do that. And I also wanted to do something that would have a straight through line. Like all great like crime exploitation, like all those men's novels of the 70s, where it was like enforcer type stuff, right? I wanted to have that element, but I also wanted it to be very modern. I knew I wanted to do a female protagonist because the last two books had male protagonists, and I do enjoy writing female characters because I think they have a different dynamic to them. I don't treat them like space aliens, so they don't come off as, I don't know, male architect versions of women, which is obnoxious and shouldn't happen. So I wrote a novel, a long novel. I'm not extraordinarily long, but it's longer than the other two books in the series. And it really pulls together elements from Blue Eel and Bleak December. And it allowed me to see really clearly the rest of the story, which I'd never realized how long it would be. I kind of thought, okay, it's these three books that are all entry points to the main story, and then the main story will happen. But now I realize, that it's a cycle of books that is very substantial, and it's going to occupy the next decade of my life, easily, right? But Divide made it so clear to me where it's going, and the next book is called Cenotaph, and it's already written. It's a shorter novel, and it's very different, but it's the last entry point. Although I would say that you could read any of these four books in any order and still enter the next phase of the story equally on good footing. There's so much that Divide really made clear to me that writing a Cenotaph was a quick write. I burned through those pages. It was easy because the hard work is now done for me, and now I get to have fun with these characters. And so Divide by Zero really liberated me from kind of the first act. The first act is always harder to write than the second and third acts, because there's so much development from the blank page to do. Anyway, so that is the Invocation. That takes you up to the creation of Divide by Zero. There will be a couple more installments in this series for my channel. And along the way, you're going to meet people who've read the book. You're going to meet the people who published the book. In the meantime, take care.